If you dare to explore the darkest mysteries, subscribe now to Ghost Whispers. The Cloaked Figure. I don't know why I even agreed to house sit for my friend that weekend. It was one of those remote houses in New Jersey, tucked away in the woods, the kind of place where you don't hear cars or people, just crickets and the occasional rustling in the trees. I thought it'd be peaceful, a break from city noise. But by the second night, I regretted every decision that led me there. It started around midnight. I was in the living room, half watching some old show on the TV while scrolling on my phone. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping, like fingers against glass. I froze, my eyes darting to the sliding door that led to the deck. It was pitch black outside, but the motion-activated porch light hadn't turned on. I told myself it was probably a branch brushing the glass and tried to ignore it. But then it happened again. Louder this time. Up. I muted the TV and stood up, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was in my throat. The tapping stopped the moment I moved. I tiptoed to the sliding door, careful not to make a sound, and pulled back the curtain just a little. My breath fogged up the glass as I peered out into the darkness. The porch light flickered on, and for a second, I saw nothing but the empty deck and the woods beyond. I almost laughed at myself for being so paranoid, but then I saw it, just at the edge of the light, barely visible. A figure. It was cloaked in something dark and heavy, and it didn't move. It just stood there, too still to be human. My hands started to shake, and I let the curtain drop back into place. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light or maybe some shadow cast by the trees. But deep down, I knew better. My instincts were screaming at me to stay away from the door. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, thinking it might scare off whoever, or whatever, was out there. When I pulled the curtain back again, the porch light was still on, but the figure was gone. Relief washed over me, but it didn't last. As I scanned the area with my phone's light, I noticed something off. The tapping sound started again, but it wasn't coming from the deck anymore. It was coming from the side window near the kitchen. My stomach dropped. There was no way someone could have moved that quickly without me seeing them. I stepped back from the sliding door, my pulse racing, and turned toward the kitchen. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, like it wanted me to come closer. I didn't want to, but it felt like I had no choice. I needed to see what it was. The window was higher up, and I had to stand on my toes to get a good look. My hands gripped the counter as I slowly lifted my head to peek out. At first, all I could see was the reflection of the kitchen in the glass. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw it again. The cloaked figure. This time it was closer, right outside the window, and its face, or where its face should have been, was shrouded in shadows. I stumbled back from the window, nearly knocking over a chair in the process. My heart was racing so fast I thought I might pass out. I grabbed a knife from the counter without even thinking, not that I believed it would help. The figure didn't move, didn't react. It just stayed there, staring, or at least I think it was staring. The longer I looked, the more I noticed something was off. The cloak wasn't just dark, it seemed to swallow the light around it, like it was made of something unnatural. And its outline wasn't steady, it shimmered, almost like heat waves rising off pavement. I wanted to call the police, but when I looked at my phone, I noticed I had no signal. Not even a single bar. That had never happened there before. My friend had said the reception was spotty sometimes, but this was different. It felt like something was blocking it. The tapping started again, this time slower, almost deliberate, like it was taunting me. I felt trapped. Running outside wasn't an option, not with that thing lurking. So I did the only thing I could think of. I locked every door and window in the house, double-checking each one as I went. But even as I locked the front door, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. After locking everything, I went back to the living room, clutching the knife like my life depended on it. I stood there for what felt like hours, straining to hear any sound over the blood pounding in my ears. The house was dead silent now. No tapping, no movement, just an oppressive stillness. I started to wonder if maybe the figure had gone, but deep down, I knew better. Then, as I stood there, the lights flickered. Once, twice, and then everything went dark. The power had gone out. My phone's flashlight was the only thing keeping me from being swallowed by the darkness. I felt exposed, like the shadows themselves were closing in on me. I thought about making a run for the car, but the driveway was long, and I'd have to pass the woods. There was no way I was risking it. Instead, I decided to barricade myself in the bedroom upstairs. I ran up the stairs, every creak of the wood making my skin crawl, and slammed the door behind me. The bedroom window overlooked the driveway, so I peeked out, hoping, praying, I might see something reassuring, like headlights in the distance. But no. Just darkness and that unnerving silence. I sat on the floor with my back pressed against the bed, clutching the knife in one hand and my phone in the other. The battery was at 20%, and the flashlight felt like my only lifeline. I kept the light pointed at the door, half expecting it to fly open at any second. Then, I heard it, slow, deliberate footsteps on the stairs. My stomach turned to ice. Whoever, or whatever, it was didn't even try to be quiet. Each step creaked loudly, echoing through the house like a warning. I held my breath, too terrified to move. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and paused, right outside the bedroom door. My hands were shaking so badly I thought I'd drop the knife. Then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. I wanted to scream, to do anything, but I was frozen in place. The knob stopped moving, and the door didn't open. For a moment, there was only silence, and I thought maybe it had gone away. But then, from the other side of the door, came a low, raspy sound. It wasn't quite a voice, more like a whisper that had been dragged through gravel. It said just one word: leave. My blood ran cold. The voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made it impossible to ignore. Leave. It echoed in my head like it had been whispered directly into my ear. I stayed frozen, gripping the knife so tightly my knuckles ached. The door didn't open, and the footsteps didn't start again. It was like whoever, or whatever, was outside the door was waiting for me to make the first move. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually, the silence became unbearable. I forced myself to get up and inch closer to the door. My phone flashlight was dimming now, the battery draining faster than it should have been. I pressed my ear to the wood, straining to hear anything, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no breathing, no whispering. Just as I started to think maybe it was gone, I heard a different sound. Scratching. Slow, deliberate, like nails dragging across the wood. It started low, near the bottom of the door, and worked its way up. My whole body was shaking, but I couldn't move. The scratching stopped right at the top of the door, and then, without warning, something slammed against it so hard the entire frame shook. The slam jolted me backward, and I nearly tripped over the edge of the bed. My heart was hammering in my chest, and every instinct was screaming at me to get out of the house. But how? The only way out was through that door, or the window. I glanced at the window, my mind racing. It was a 2-story drop, but at that moment, a broken leg felt like a better option than whatever was on the other side of that door. Before I could decide, the scratching started again. This time, it wasn't on the door. It was coming from inside the room. My breath caught in my throat as I whipped the flashlight around, scanning the walls, the ceiling, the floor. Nothing. The room was empty, but the sound kept moving, circling me, closing in. It felt like it was coming from everywhere at once. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence was suffocating. My phone's flashlight flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging me into darkness. For a few seconds, I couldn't even breathe. The darkness was so thick it felt like it was pressing against me, and I couldn't tell if my eyes were open or closed. I fumbled with my phone, desperately trying to turn the flashlight back on, but the screen stayed black. That's when I heard it. A faint rustling sound, like fabric shifting, coming from the corner of the room. My chest tightened as I slowly turned my head toward the noise, even though I couldn't see anything. The sound grew louder, closer, and then stopped right in front of me. I could feel it. Something was there, standing inches away, and I didn't need to see it to know. My skin prickled, and my body was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream. Then, in the pitch-black silence, I felt it. A cold, dry hand brushed against my arm. It was light, almost gentle, but it sent a jolt of pure terror through me. I stumbled backward, finally finding my voice, and let out a scream that felt like it tore through my entire body. My scream echoed through the house, but there was no response. No footsteps rushing toward me, no voice calling out. Just silence, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I scrambled back until my shoulder hit the wall, clutching the knife so tightly my fingers were cramping. I swung it blindly in front of me, desperate to keep whatever it was away. My eyes started to adjust to the darkness, just enough to make out shapes. And then I saw it. The figure was there, standing in the corner of the room. It was the same cloaked shape I'd seen outside, but now it was inside, impossibly close. The cloak looked almost alive, shifting and writhing like shadows caught in a storm. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel it staring at me. My breathing turned shallow as it raised a hand, thin, bony, and unnaturally long, and pointed at me. That same gravelly whisper filled the room, louder this time but still impossible to place. "Leave," it said again, and this time, the word didn't feel like a command. It felt like a warning. Something in the way it spoke, the way it pointed, made me realize staying there wasn't an option. It didn't want to hurt me, it wanted me gone. Summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I bolted for the window. I didn't care about the drop or the glass, I just needed to get out. I threw the window open and climbed out, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. I braced myself and jumped, landing hard on the gravel driveway. My ankle twisted painfully, but I didn't stop. I hobbled to my car as fast as I could, fumbling with the keys, my hand shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. When I finally got inside, I locked the doors and started the engine, not daring to look back at the house. As I sped down the dark, empty road, I glanced in the rear-view mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw it standing in the driveway, watching me leave, but when I looked again, there was nothing there. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back in town, where the streetlights and the hum of civilization made me feel safe again. I told my friend I couldn't house-sit anymore and refused to explain why. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that house. All I know is that whatever it wasn't human, and it didn't want me there. The Neighborhood Murderer. I grew up in a quiet little neighborhood where everyone knew each other. It was the kind of place where parents let their kids play outside until the streetlights came on, trusting that nothing bad would ever happen. One of my neighbors was a guy named Danny. He was in his late 30s when I was a kid, and he always gave off this strange vibe. He wasn't married, no kids, and barely talked to anyone. But he wasn't a complete recluse either. He'd wave to people, show up at barbecues, and make small talk with the neighbors. Everyone thought he was just shy or maybe a little awkward. I never thought much about him back then, but I did notice he would sometimes watch us kids playing from his porch. Not in an overtly creepy way, but enough to make me feel uneasy when I'd catch him looking. It wasn't until years later that I found out what Danny had been hiding. One summer, when I was in my mid-20s and back visiting my parents, I overheard my mom talking on the phone about a big police raid down the street. Apparently, Danny had been arrested, but no one knew why. A few days later, the news broke that he was linked to a string of disappearances in the area. I couldn't believe it. My childhood neighbor, the quiet guy who handed out full-sized candy bars on Halloween, had been kidnapping and murdering women for years. And not just killing them, he'd kept them in his basement for days, maybe weeks, before finally ending their lives. At first, I didn't want to believe it. I mean, how could someone like Danny, who had lived among us all those years, be capable of such horrifying things? But the more details that came out, the harder it was to deny. The police found photos, journals, and what they described as trophies from his victims hidden in his house. I remember the pit in my stomach when I heard about the journals. Apparently, he'd written down everything. Every sick thought, every twisted plan, every awful thing he did to those poor women. It was hard to even look at his house after that. It went from being just another house on the block to this looming, sinister reminder of what had been happening right under our noses. What really stuck with me, though, was learning how close I might have come to being one of his victims. My mom mentioned that Danny had once offered to babysit me and my brother when we were little. My parents had said no because my grandma lived nearby and was always happy to watch us. But the thought of what could have happened if they'd said yes still makes my skin crawl. Even worse, some of the women he killed were people I'd seen around the neighborhood. Women who had smiled at me in the grocery store or walked their dogs past my house. The realization that they were gone because of him made me feel like the world I grew up in was a lie. Things got even more disturbing when the trial started. I didn't go in person, but I followed every update obsessively, like everyone else in the neighborhood. The prosecutors painted a picture of a man who had lived a double life, one where he seemed harmless but was actually a monster. They brought in crime scene photos, interviews with survivors who had narrowly escaped him, and even the tapes he had made. Yeah, tapes. Turns out he had recorded some of the things he did to his victims. I couldn't even read the articles describing them without feeling physically sick. And still, there was this eerie part of me that couldn't fully grasp it. That this was Danny. The same guy who'd once helped my dad fix our lawnmower. I think what haunted me the most was hearing from the families of his victims. They talked about their loved ones, the lives they had before they crossed paths with Danny. One woman was a nurse at the local hospital who'd saved countless lives. Another was a young mom, out on a quick trip to pick up diapers for her baby. Their stories made it impossible to detach from the reality of what he had done. It wasn't just some scary story you'd see on TV. It was real. These were real people, and Danny had taken them away in the most horrifying way imaginable. For weeks, the entire neighborhood felt heavy, like there was a dark cloud hanging over us that wouldn't go away. After the trial, when Danny was sentenced to death, you'd think the neighborhood would have felt some kind of relief. But it didn't. At least, I didn't. Instead, it felt like the damage had already been done, and no verdict could undo it. His house sat empty for months, boarded up with police tape fluttering in the wind. People started avoiding that side of the street altogether, like just walking by it could curse them. I don't know if it was just my imagination, but even the air felt colder when you got close to that place. Eventually, someone bought the house, but they tore it down before moving in. I think everyone was glad to see it go. It was like erasing a scar, even if the wound underneath was still there. The execution happened a few years later. By then, I had moved out of town, trying to leave all those memories behind. But I couldn't resist following the news when the day came. They said Danny went quietly, no last words, just stared straight ahead until it was over. I thought it would give me closure, but it didn't. If anything, it brought back all those feelings of unease. I couldn't stop thinking about how normal he had seemed all those years. How many times I'd waved to him, sat near him at block parties, or seen him walking his dog. It made me realize that you can never really know the people around you. Even now, years later, I can't shake the memories of that time. Every now and then, something will remind me of Danny, and it's like all the fear and disbelief come rushing back. One time, I was at a thrift store and saw a jacket that looked just like the one he used to wear, a faded denim thing he always had on, even in the summer. For a split second, I felt like I couldn't breathe, like I was back on that street, catching him watching us kids from his porch. It's weird how little things like that can trigger such a deep reaction. I don't know if I'll ever completely stop looking over my shoulder or questioning the intentions of people who seem normal. The scariest part, though, is knowing there are probably more people like Danny out there. People who blend in, who smile at you in passing, who seem harmless until they aren't. It's made me hyper-aware of my surroundings, but it's also left me with this lingering paranoia. I hate that he took that from me, the ability to trust, to feel safe in my own community. I've tried to move on, to remind myself that what happened was an anomaly, but there's always that voice in the back of my head telling me to stay on guard. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it's better to never let your guard down. One thing that still keeps me awake some nights is the thought of how close he was to us, to me. He wasn't some stranger lurking in a dark alley. He was right there, part of my childhood, part of the fabric of our neighborhood. I think about all the chances he had, all the times he could have done something terrible to someone I loved, or even to me. And it wasn't luck that saved us, it was just circumstance. A different babysitter, a different route home, a different decision, and I might not be here to tell this story. It's terrifying how thin that line is, how easily things could have gone the other way. In the end, I guess the scariest part isn't what Danny did, it's what he represented. He was proof that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes, it looks like your neighbor, the guy who mows his lawn every Saturday or waves at your mom while she's gardening. It's that realization that has stayed with me the longest. Even now, years after his execution, I still find myself questioning the people around me, wondering what they're capable of, what they're hiding behind their polite smiles and friendly hellos. I've tried to let it go, to not let it define how I see the world, but some nights, when the house is quiet and the memories creep back in, it's hard not to feel like I'm still living in his shadow. Highway encounter with creeps. I've always been a cautious driver, especially at night. My mom drilled it into me growing up. Never drive distracted, always lock your doors, and avoid stopping in isolated areas. But no matter how careful you are, some things just find you. That night, I was driving home from a late shift at work. It was already past midnight, and the roads were pretty empty except for the occasional car speeding by. I was about 15 minutes from home when I hit a red light at this intersection that always seemed to take forever to change. I remember glancing at my phone on the passenger seat, debating whether I should grab it to check the time, but then I caught movement in my peripheral vision, headlights pulling up next to me. It was a dark sedan, windows tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. At first, I didn't think much of it. Just another car on the road, right? But then the window rolled down, and I noticed two guys leaning out, their faces half lit by the red glow of the traffic light. They were laughing, but not the kind of laugh that makes you feel at ease. One of them whistled, and the other called out something I couldn't quite make out. I stared straight ahead, gripping the wheel, hoping they'd just get bored. But they didn't. When the light turned green, I pressed on the gas, praying they'd turn off somewhere. Instead, they started tailing me, their car suddenly way too close to mine. I tried to stay calm and tell myself it wasn't a big deal. Maybe they were just messing around and would back off soon. But then they sped up and pulled alongside me again, matching my speed. I glanced over, hoping to look indifferent, and saw the driver grinning at me, mouthing something I couldn't hear over the sound of both our engines. His buddy was gesturing wildly, pointing at me and laughing like it was some kind of game. That's when I noticed the driver waving a cigarette in one hand, as if showing off, while steering with the other. My stomach churned. I sped up slightly, thinking I could lose them if I just stayed cool and drove smart. But they weren't letting up. Every time I switched lanes, so did they. If I slowed down, they did too. It was like they were toying with me, seeing how far they could push it. My hands were sweating against the steering wheel, and I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears. I thought about calling 911, but my phone was just out of reach on the passenger seat, and the idea of fumbling for it while driving scared me even more. Instead, I decided to make an abrupt turn onto a smaller, quieter road, hoping they'd lose interest or get stuck at the next light. But as I turned, I caught a glimpse of their headlights in my mirror. They followed me. The smaller road I turned onto was darker than I expected, lined with trees and only a few scattered houses. My heart sank as I realized I'd made a mistake. There was no traffic, no witnesses, and nowhere to go if things escalated. Their car stayed close, and I could hear the faint rumble of their engine behind me. My breathing was shallow, and I could feel the panic starting to creep in. I didn't want to stop, but I didn't know what my next move should be. That's when they honked, a loud, aggressive blare that made me jump in my seat. It felt like a warning, like they were letting me know they weren't done playing with me yet. I spotted a turnoff ahead, a narrow gravel road that led into what looked like a residential area. Without thinking, I took it, hoping they'd think twice about following me into a more confined space. But they didn't hesitate. Their car sped up, and for a moment, I thought they were going to ram me. I was gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, my eyes darting between the road ahead and my rearview mirror. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. What if they forced me off the road? What if they had weapons? I could feel tears stinging my eyes, but I blinked them back, focusing on the road, praying for some kind of escape. As the gravel crunched under my tires, I noticed a house up ahead with its porch light on. It wasn't close to the road, but it was something, a sign of life. Without thinking, I swerved into their long driveway and slammed on the brakes, hoping they'd assume I was pulling up to someone's house and leave me alone. For a second, it looked like it might work. Their car hesitated at the entrance, their headlights illuminating the side of my car. I could see their silhouettes moving inside, like they were arguing about what to do next. My hands shook as I reached for my phone, finally grabbing it off the passenger seat. But before I could dial anything, their car jerked forward, turning into the driveway behind me. My stomach dropped. I knew I couldn't just sit there, so I reversed hard, my tires kicking up a cloud of dust as I aimed for the road again. I thought maybe I could outmaneuver them, but as I sped back onto the street, they were right on my tail, closer than ever. My whole body felt electric with fear, like every nerve was screaming at me to get out of there. The road ahead was winding and unfamiliar, but I pushed the speedometer as high as I dared. The headlights in my mirror were blinding, and every time I took a turn, they were right behind me, matching every move. It felt like there was no way to shake them. I don't know how long I kept driving like that, but it felt like hours even though it was probably only a few minutes. The road started to widen as I approached an intersection, and I spotted a gas station up ahead, its fluorescent lights buzzing like a beacon in the darkness. There were a couple of cars parked out front, and I could see someone inside through the glass doors. I made a split-second decision and veered into the parking lot, slamming the brakes hard enough that my tires screeched. I didn't even bother parking properly. I just threw the car into park and bolted out, running straight for the gas station entrance. When I reached the door, I turned back to look, and my heart nearly stopped. Their car had pulled into the lot too, idling just far enough away to stay in the shadows. The driver's side door opened, and one of the guys stepped out, staring at me. I was frozen for a second, my mind racing with what to do next, but then the clerk inside must have noticed me because he waved me in. The sound of the automatic door sliding open snapped me out of it, and I stumbled inside, trying to explain what was happening to the clerk while keeping an eye on the guy outside. He didn't move closer, but I could feel his eyes on me, like he was waiting for something. The clerk was an older man, and as I tried to explain, he seemed more confused than alarmed. I was rambling, my words coming out in a frantic rush. "They've been following me. They're outside. They won't leave me alone." I pointed toward the parking lot, but when we both looked, the guy was already back in the car, and they were reversing out of the lot. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. Instead of driving off, they stopped at the edge of the lot. Their car angled just enough to keep the headlights pointed in my direction. They weren't leaving. They were waiting. I stayed inside the gas station for what felt like an eternity. The clerk offered to call the police, but I hesitated, scared that the moment I stepped outside, they'd come back. I kept peeking out the window, trying to convince myself it was safe, but they just stayed there, their car idling like they had all the time in the world. At one point, another customer pulled in, and I thought maybe I could slip out unnoticed, but as soon as the other car left, they inched closer to the station. My chest felt tight, and my legs were shaky. It hit me then, I couldn't wait them out. I finally decided I had to make a run for it. The clerk offered to walk me to my car, but I shook my head, not wanting to put him in danger. Instead, I waited for a moment when the lot was clear, hoping their attention had wavered. When I stepped outside, I kept my keys gripped tightly in my hand, my thumb on the panic button. The second I got into my car, I locked the doors and started the engine. For a moment, it seemed like they weren't going to move. I thought maybe they'd finally given up, but as soon as I pulled out of the lot, their headlights flipped on. They followed me for a few blocks, staying just far enough behind to make it feel deliberate, like they wanted me to know they were still there. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely steer, but then, without warning, they turned down a side street and disappeared. I kept driving, too scared to look back, until I finally made it home. I don't even remember parking or locking the door behind me. I just sat on the floor of my living room, shaking. Even now, I have no idea what they wanted or why they gave up when they did. All I know is that I've never driven that late at night again.